Just as little is the persistence of the universal consciousness in its judgment and unmasking and abolition of hypocrisy, in denouncing hypocrisy as base, vile, and so on, it is appealing in such judgment to its own law, just as the evil consciousness appeals to its law. For the former comes forward in opposition to the latter, and thereby as a particular law. It has therefore no superiority over the other law. Rather, it legitimizes it. And this zeal does the very opposite of what it means to do, for it shows that what it calls true or genuine duty, and which ought to be universally acknowledged, is something not acknowledged. In doing so, it concedes to the other an equal right to be for itself. Paragraph 663 is a relatively short one, and it would be tempting, as we want to get to the end of the morality section, which now we can see on the horizon, to move past it pretty quickly and say, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying here. This is balancing this is balancing that. Now let's move on to the next developments. But really we should pause and linger and look closely at what Hegel's saying here, and also what he doesn't say here, what he leaves for us to sort of unpack and open up through our own questioning. So to begin with, he uses the same terminology about persistence, beharren, sort of remaining in a attitude or state, insisting over and over again upon something. And the insistence in this case is a judgment made by the universal consciousness. So now it's the universal consciousness that is persisting. It's no longer the evil, singular acting consciousness who is, insisting on doing its own thing. Now there's two sides to this, right? So he tells us just as little is the persistence of the universal consciousness in its judgment. So that's the mode of how it is, as he's going to say a few paragraphs later, how it's acting. Now, judgment and action, not exactly the same thing, right? Action is doing something. I can judge that it would be good for me to write these things on the chalkboard, or to walk across the room, or to create a video. Actually doing that is something quite different. I have to commit myself. And as we're going to see, looking ahead a little bit, and also thinking a little bit behind to the beautiful soul. What makes a beautiful soul a beautiful soul? The fact that it doesn't do anything, it just judges. It passes judgment. It also says something about itself, that it's so good because it's doing the right thing, but it's not doing anything other than, you could say, communicating and cognizing. And perhaps even we might say it works in the domain of affectivity or the will as well. So just as little as the persistence of the universal consciousness in its judgment, and unmasking and abolition, Auflösung, right? We can also say undoing as well, of the hypocrisy that it has been saying is there in the individual evil consciousness, right? So this is a hypocrite, and we have to denounce hypocrisy. We have to pass a judgment, Urteil, right? We have to take our part, you might say, if we want to play off the tile part of the term. And we want to strip off the mask. We want to thereby undo the hypocrisy. We want to get the hypocrite, the evil consciousness, to say, oh yeah, I've been wrong. I shouldn't have done that. And instead, the evil consciousness persisted. And so what we've got here basically is two consciousnesses saying, it is, it isn't. It is, it isn't. Going back and forth like cartoon characters, right? So, he goes on and he says, in denouncing hypocrisy as base, vile, and so on, und so weiter, right? So the and so on is basically etc. These are not the only things that the hypocrite could be called. We might come up with all sorts of other examples. So base, schlecht, right? The lower consciousness, the person who's actually going back to the earlier dialectics. We oppose this to the noble consciousness. Vile, niederträchtig, right? Bringing things down to the lower level, tearing things down, right? So hypocrisy is bad. It's a bad thing. We don't want to be that or do that, he says. And so we're judging as the universal consciousness that that's the case. He says, in doing this, in denouncing hypocrisy, it is appealing in such judgment to a law, to a gazette. So we can call this law, we can call this norm, we could call it normativity, whatever we want here. But is this law, like in capital letters, for everybody, all at the same time, and this evil consciousness over here is holding itself stubbornly, hypocritically, however we want to put it, vilely against the law that everybody recognizes? Well, that's the way universal consciousness is spinning it at first, but now universal consciousness gets to see that it's really its own law. It's not a law for everybody. In fact, it's coming from universal consciousness just as much as the law or norm or whatever we're going to say that the individual is following is coming from itself. And so it's not really, for universal consciousness, a universal law. Instead, he says, it's appealing in such judgment to its own law, just as the evil consciousness appeals to its law. So now we have two laws. As the former, that is universal consciousness, comes forward in opposition to the latter, and thereby as a particular law. So we have now two particular laws, two particular, let's call them, ways of arranging things, of valuing things, of deciding what principles count and what principles don't. Two particular ways confronting each other. How do we choose between them? You know, the universal consciousness has been saying, my law is the law, but now it undergoes a sort of crisis of confidence, you might say. So he says, it has therefore no superiority over the other law. Rather, now here's one of the places where we should ask a question. Rather, it legitimizes it. And here, the term that Hegel's using is actually, in German, legitimisieren, right? So it's transliterating it to call it legitimizes it. It gives it legitimacy. What does that mean here? And why? Why would it legitimize it rather than, say, nullifying both laws at the same time? Hegel doesn't tell us, unless the clue is in what follows. So he says, this zeal does the very opposite of what it means to do. So what's zeal? The zeal on the part of universal consciousness to denounce hypocrisy. It does the exact opposite of denouncing hypocrisy, and thereby instead legitimizes the law, the norm, the way of operating that the individual evil consciousness has worked out for itself. And what does that mean now? Does that mean that everything becomes hypocrisy, everything becomes base, vile, just as much on this side? So Hegel said that this legitimizes it instead of just simply tearing it down. The next thing that he says is equally, on its surface, puzzling, at least when we read it. So again, we have to be very careful readers of the text. He says, the zeal does the very opposite of what it means to do. Why? For it shows what it calls true or genuine duty. Now, here Miller is actually, true and genuine, both just wahr, right? True. So he didn't have to add in the extra thing. True and genuine duty, wahre Pflicht. True and genuine duty, what it's calling that, what it's naming as that, and which ought to be universally acknowledged, right? So there's already some other moral terminology in here, soll. And sollen is a modal verb in German, and it denotes sometimes, well, that's the sort of thing that should happen, what we expect. In this case, it's saying this is a moral requirement. This should be acknowledged. This true and genuine duty ought to be acknowledged universally. And acknowledged. Now, isn't that an interesting expression to use at this point? Acknowledge recognition, right? Anerkennen, something that we've been looking for through the entire phenomenology, recognized as such in the self-consciousness section, worked out in greater and greater detail in the reason and spirit section, which we're approaching the end of. Now, can recognition be given to duty? Or is duty being treated almost in a personal way at that point, as if it has more than just something to be, recognized and then followed, but something to be obeyed, something to be treated as having an agency of its own? Well, in this section, duty is within us. So I think that's something that we could say, right? And we've had a number of points in this subsection where the person or the community is in fact what is looking to be recognized and providing recognition. So it should be acknowledged. And then Hegel says it's something not acknowledged, and it's displayed as so, right? Something not acknowledged, displayed as nicht anerkanntes. And you could translate that as something that's not acknowledged, or you could translate it as the not acknowledged, right? And so this is quite interesting here. We're going to come back to this in a moment. He says, in doing so, it concedes, what's the it? Universal consciousness, to the other an equal right to be for itself, an equal right to für sich sein, not just an equal right to be for itself, an equal right of being for itself, of calling its own shots, of judging itself. It doesn't just have to accept the judgment coming from the universal consciousness. Now, I do want to come back to this for a moment. This is something Hegel is not saying here, but this reminds me of something that comes up in ethics class after ethics class after ethics class whenever I teach it. There's always some people who, when they hear about some sort of universal norms, and it could be utilitarian, it could be deontological, it could be virtue ethics, it could be whatever you want. They're always like, but people break the rules, so the rules can't really be rules, can they? They're mixing up like universal law, say of gravity, with universal laws that would apply to human beings. And this is part of what's peculiar, not just to ethics, but to human beings. We can make norms for ourselves, and we can break those norms. It really depends on recognition of those norms, doesn't it? And of our duties, or of whatever else we're going to frame it as, whatever principles we're going to use. This is not, I think, a defect within ethics. I think this is part of what makes ethics ethics. And so I'm going to leave that pregnant phrase out there. That doesn't actually tie in so much with the movement going here, but it's an interesting side note to pick up on. This judgment has, however, at the same time another aspect from which it becomes the way to a resolution of the antithesis confronting it. The consciousness of the universal, in its relation to the first evil consciousness, does not behave as one that is actual and acts. For the latter is rather the actual consciousness, but in its antithesis to it, it is a consciousness that is not entangled in the antithesis of individuality and universality, which occurs when action is entered upon. It remains in the universality of thought, behaves as a consciousness that apprehends, and its first action is merely one of judgment. Now, through this judgment, it places itself, as we have just remarked, alongside the first consciousness, and the latter, through this likeness, comes to see its own self in this other consciousness. For the consciousness of duty maintains an attitude of passive apprehension, but it is thereby in contradiction with itself as the absolute will of duty, as a consciousness whose determining comes solely from itself, It does well to preserve itself in its purity, for it does not act. It is the hypocrisy which wants its judgment to be taken for an actual deed, and instead of proving its rectitude by actions, does so by uttering fine sentiments. Its nature, then, is altogether the same as that which is reproached with making duty a mere matter of words. In both alike, the side of reality is distinct from the words uttered, in the one through the selfish purpose of the action, in the other through the failure to act at all. Although the necessity to act is involved in the very talk of duty, for duty without deeds is utterly meaningless. Paragraph 664 begins in a rather promising way. He says, this judgment has, however, at the same time another aspect from which it becomes the way to a resolution of the antithesis confronting it. And when we get to the end of the paragraph, we'll see that this is not as much of a resolution, an Auflösung, as we had hoped for. I do want to point out, though, before we jump into this, so, Miller has a tendency to translate using the term antithesis in ways that can be a little bit confusing. Contradiction would be another way of talking about this here, or even opposition, Gegensatz. Vorhandenen Gegensatz, the contradiction or the antithesis that is presenting itself, that is ready at hand, that is there to be seen for these shapes of consciousness that are confronting each other, both concerned with conscience and with duty. And so looking at this judgment, this Urteil that's being made on the part of universal consciousness, which here he talks about as consciousness of the universal, we're going to come back to that in a moment as well, is going to help us to resolve these oppositions. And this is a paragraph that's full of terminology of opposition. Another term that's being translated as antithesis and Gegengesetzt, being set over against something else. There's also Widerspruch in here as well, and then there's the contradiction between universality and individuality, which is also called an antithesis. So there's a lot of being conscious of things being set against each other, being opposed to each other. And the question is, how are these going to move? How are these going to shift? What sort of transformation of consciousness are we going to have here? So he says, the consciousness of the universal. Now, why doesn't he just say the universal consciousness, as he's been, doing in the paragraphs previously, or even just the universal, das Allgemeine, right? The consciousness of the universal. Should we read in there that there is a shift taking place here? That the universal is no longer just a consciousness, and rather now there is starting to be a slide where the consciousness that's been viewing itself as universal is now realizing it's not quite as universal. That would be set up by the previous paragraph, would it not? So I think that's arguably a good way to read this shift in language. He goes on and he says, the consciousness of the universal in its relationship to the first, evil consciousness, does not behave as one that is actual. It's not wirklich, right? And acts. It doesn't engage in conduct, handeln, not just individual action, but like courses of action. Why? Because the latter is rather the actual consciousness, the first, evil, particular consciousness, which now we've seen has a law of its own, right? That is one that in fact does act, that behaves, that risks, that goes out into the world. So he goes on and he says, the latter is the actual consciousness, but in its antithesis to it, so how it's being set against, how it's setting itself against it, is a consciousness that is not entangled in what is happening over here on the part of the acting consciousness, the individual consciousness, being entangled in the antithesis of individuality and universality, which occurs, he says, when action, handeln again here, is entered upon. So, if you're going to do something, if you're actually going to try to follow duty, if you're going to make some sort of effort to change the world, even to change oneself, that goes beyond making judgments, cognizing, talking. When you're engaging the will, which is the faculty that does affect the world, then you get engaged in what we saw earlier in this section, this antithesis between universality, individuality. Just to skip ahead a little bit, what is the individuality problematic side? Well, selfishness, being self-centered here, and taking cues from one's natural being. And that natural being includes, what Kant called the inclinations and desires that you have as a being that has a body and is acting in certain ways and has been shaped by experiences and psychological laws, has certain propensities. But you could say that it also includes other aspects as well, not just this, being a natural thing, a very complex natural thing, but also this, it's motivated equally by a certain desire for recognition. That's part of our nature. So, coming back to this, right, we've got this distinction here now that's not happening on the side of the consciousness of the universal. So what is happening? He says it remains in the universality of thought. So it's not the universality of community, it's not the universality of language, it's not the universality of duty and action, it's the universality of just thinking. And it can involve those, of course, right? That can happen through a community, through communication, right? But it's not doing anything. So he goes on and he says, here we go, universality of thought behaves as a consciousness that apprehends. Now, behaves there is not in a form of acting. Apprehending, aufassendes, right? It's describing how this thing is. It's grasping itself. It's grasping this antithesis. It's grasping what's going on. It's going to be unhappy about that in just a moment. And its first action, he says, is merely one of judgment. Judgment is not yet acting. Now, is it? It's saying things about stuff, but anybody can judge. Actually doing things. I mean, we should pause on this for a minute and think about this. We live in a universe saturated by traditional media that is morphed in very interesting ways, and social media. And most of the time, people are blathering and making judgments about stuff, very often without any real insight into what they're judging about. Many people take that as having engaged in action. So, posting pictures of homeless people and saying the government should be doing something about that, that's a judgment. Actually getting yourself out there and taking food to, or hand warmers or whatever it's going to be to people in tent cities, that's action. Those are two very different domains. Now, judgment can lead to action, but judgment by itself isn't action and can often become a substitute for action, can't it? That's what's happening on the part of the universal in relation to the evil consciousness, the singular consciousness. So he says, through this judgment, it places itself, as we've just remarked, alongside Neben, the first consciousness, and the latter, through this likeness, comes to see its own self in the other consciousness. Now here he says, for the consciousness of duty maintains an attitude of passive apprehension, but it is thereby in contradiction with itself as the absolute will of duty, as a consciousness whose determining comes solely from itself. So this is an interesting phrase, the absolute will of duty. Duty, if it's taken as seriously as it should be, would lead to willing, would lead to a faculty not only of choosing, but of deciding, of committing oneself, of doing something. The will leads to action. So we have a contradiction here, a Widerspruch, a contradiction within itself. On whose side? On the side of the consciousness of the universal. How so? He goes on and he says, it does well to preserve itself in its purity, for it does not act. And now notice, who's the hypocrite here, man? Right? It's not just the one who's accused of hypocrisy by the universal consciousness. The hypocrisy is on both sides. Okay, common realization, right? The world is a flawed one, and anybody can be viewed as a hypocrite. In this case, though, there is a hypocrisy, condemning the other for hypocrisy when it's a hypocrite itself. It's sort of like, meta-hypocrisy in this case. He says, it is the hypocrisy which wants its judging to be taken for an actual deed, and instead of proving its rectitude by actions, does so by uttering fine sentiments. This is the person who condemns what the government is doing, but doesn't do a thing about it other than, signing petitions and posting things on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or what have you. This is the lover who professes love but doesn't actually do any actions involved in externalizing that emotion, that act of willing. This is the person who claims that they care for others under their charge but actually exploits them, or doesn't do anything to prevent their exploitation by others. We could multiply example after example after example, right? And so that's what's happening on the side of the universal. It is a hypocrisy that wants judging to be taken for an actual deed. So he says, its nature, therefore, is altogether the same as that which is reproach, which making duty a mere matter of words. What is this? The beautiful soul, right? That we saw before. Now, in both alike, he says, the side of reality is distinct from the words uttered. In the one, now, who's the both alike? We come back to the singular consciousness, the consciousness of the universal. They're both hypocrites in some way, right? The singular, because of its own selfishness. It says that it's trying to fulfill duty, but it really just wants to do what it wants to do because it's good for it. It's satisfying the demands or desires or drives of its natural being, and then masking that with, saying, I'm doing the right thing. But this over here is, in some respect, more contemptible. It doesn't do anything. It just talks. It comes up with, spreadsheets and plans and all sorts of, manifestos and wonderful things that I suppose it could get another universal or another consciousness of the universal to buy into, and they could both sit together in the coffee shop and pour over them and be like, oh man, this is so excellent. But it doesn't do anything. So it is just as hypocritical. He says, the failure to act at all, though the necessity to act is involved in the very talk of duty. And here's how he closes this. For duty without deeds is utterly meaningless. Moral obligation, recognition of what one ought to do, whether it be in relation to oneself, in relation to the other, in relation to society, the environment even. Moral duty without action, as he says, is not just mere words, it's utterly meaningless. The words themselves slowly lose their significance.